Okay. It is 12 o'clock and we already have a lot of participants here with us today. Thank you so much for spending your lunch hour with us for the second segment of the Internalizing Equity series. It's going to be an Empowered Community Voices panel consisting of a variety of community leaders, as you see here, from across the state. And today we're going to reiterate the need to identify planning solutions by centering community strengths versus lacks in order to build proximity and solidarity, especially with marginalized communities. And this will all be shared through our panelists' personal and professional experiences in their work to center equity in their professions. So my name is Claudia Loaiza, and I am a master's student in the City and Metropolitan Planning Program, and I have the incredible honor to serve as your moderator today. And before we dive into the discussion though, I do want to turn the time over to Stacy. And Stacy, there we go. Stacy Harwood is our department chair, and she's going to be providing a land acknowledgement for us today. So I'm going to pass it on to Stacy for that.
Thanks, Claudia. Okay, just moving things around here on my screen. Okay, so I'm going to read the land acknowledgement. We acknowledge this land, which is named for the Ute tribe. It is the unceded traditional and ancestral homeland of the Shoshone, Paiute, Goshu, and Ute tribes. The University of Utah acknowledges the significance of place and the continued existence and contributions of Indigenous people who have lived on and cared for this land for thousands of years. We respect the sovereign relationship between tribes, states, and the federal government. And we affirm the University of Utah's commitment to a partnership with Native nations and urban Indian communities through research, education, and community outreach activities.
Thank you so much, Stacy. I am really grateful to Stacy. First off, I do want to acknowledge all of her work that she does for the department, for the college. She is an incredible asset to us and always an approachable source for students and faculty. So shout out to Stacy in general and for that. And for those that just joined us too, just as a reminder, this is our second segment of the Internalizing Equity series. You're joining us for an Empowered Community Voices panel. We've got a variety of community leaders and activists and advocates here with us who are going to be helping us identify ways to build proximity and solidarity with communities, especially those that have been marginalized historically, and they're going to be doing that through their professional and personal experiences. So with that, like I mentioned, this workshop is made possible by these exceptional panelists, and I'm going to introduce them a little bit by reading off their bios and listing them by name. So first we have Ashley Cleveland, who is a founding board member for Curlyme, a board of trustees member for the Tracy Aviary, an outdoor recreation advisory board member for GOED, Utah's only outdoor Afro leader, and she manages the program, the Promise program in Utah's youngest city of Millcreek. Ashley does so much. I'm sure you got that from what I just read. And she is also an ecologist and thinks representation is key in so many important workings of our everyday life and how we build cities to meet the natural world. Thank you, Ashley. And we also have Maria Garciaz, who's the CEO of NeighborWorks Salt Lake, which is a 43-year-old nonprofit community development organization with a mission of comprehensive neighborhood revitalization with a focus on housing and leadership. And we have Meredith Lamb, a proud member of the Dene Navajo Nation and the program director for the nonprofit organization called Navajo Strong. She's also the director of American Indian and Alaska Native Education for Provo City School District. We also have Council Member Darren Mano, who serves on the Salt Lake City Council representing District 5. He is the principal and founder of the architecture firm Raw Design Studio, is an alumnus of the University of Utah and Harvard University, and has actually taught architecture and urban design courses here at the College of Architecture and Planning. And we also have Michaela Respicio Evans, who is a planning project manager with Envision Utah, who is passionate about increasing the accessibility of planning and centering the community within the planning process. And last but not least, we have Joe Taylor, who is an MCMP grad from 2010 and a transportation planner in Salt Lake City, where he focuses on how transportation policy and practice can incorporate equity, the environment, and the economy to improve the everyday experience of people's lives. So an incredible lineup. I'm sure you can agree that we have a huge expanse of experiences, expertise, and skills here. So please be engaged. Feel free to engage with each other in the chat as we kind of dive into this panel discussion. After we finish our discussion with the panelists, we're going to be going into an open Q&A session where we're going to monitor the chat, and you are also welcome to raise your hand through Zoom so that you can vocally ask questions to our panelists. So in general, as we're talking, please engage with each other in the chat if you hear something that resonates with you, or if you want to share something that is relevant. But with that, let's get started with the round robin question. So to the panelists, tell us a bit more about the work that you do and how you center equity in your day-to-day with communities. If each of you could share for 1 to 2 minutes, that would be great. And I'm going to start with whoever is just closest to my Zoom screen here, and that is Councilmember Mano. So if you could start us off and then pass it on to the next panelist, that would be great.
Thanks, Claudia. I'm so honored to be here. Thank you for the invitation. The first question, I think, so when I talk about my day-to-day work, it's always kind of split. So half of my time is spent as a council member and half of my time is spent running an architecture firm. And I think in both positions, the thing that I've tried to focus the most on is representation. So in my practice as an architecture, owning an architecture firm, I've tried really hard to hire people from diverse backgrounds. We're now a firm of 10, and I have only one of those 10 is a straight white male. So I feel like we've been able to get a lot of people from diverse backgrounds, people from different countries, some people here on work visas, and I think that's really been developed like a good, strong, diverse team. And I think that that's really important, especially in architecture, which is not traditionally a very welcoming career to minorities. And then as a council member, I think it's really important for us to make sure that our department and our decisions are being made by people that are not just allies, but that actually are from diverse backgrounds. One thing that I've been thinking a lot about recently is our police department. We've been asked a lot to think about our police department equity over the past year, and I've been asking at every point that I can is what can we do to get more diverse backgrounds within our police department so that the department itself can match the city, so that when a person of color interacts with a police officer, they may be able to interact with someone that they look like, and that instantly builds a little bit of trust between the department and the community, which I think is lacking right now. I'll just leave it at that. I think I may have gone over my time.
Thank you so much, Councilmember Mono. Maria, did you want to go next?
Yeah, hi everyone. Good afternoon, Claudia. Thank you for moderating, and Stacy for hosting this through your school. So NeighborWorks Salt Lake is an organization that was created in 1977 to reverse the decline of neighborhoods experiencing blight as a result of redlining and disinvestment. So already we're talking about serving neighborhoods that have experienced systemic inequities. And we work in partnership with stakeholders in these neighborhoods, public sector, private sector, and more importantly, the residents, to transform the neighborhoods that we serve through lending, through real estate development, through community engagement and economic development. And our programs are very focused on serving residents who may not understand or have access to mainstream resources like banks, like local government departments, like even civic organizations, community councils, for example. Not a lot of the residents that we work with feel like they can go to a community council. So we really try to engage both sides of those groups to come together and have a conversation. So I will turn time over to Ashley.
Good afternoon, everyone. Claudia, thank you so much for the invite. I'm so excited to share space with all of you. I work as the Promise Program Manager for Millcreek. Millcreek is trying to close equity gaps with volunteers that focus on access to health, education, economic well-being, and safety within our city boundaries. As Maria has stated, that usually highlights a systematic inequity with our populations. So that creates for a diverse engagement with our residents and parents. That's who I tend to deal with, as children and families. I'm essentially a city planner and volunteer manager hybrid, sprinkled with data and collective impact. So I try my best to make sure, at least when I'm looking at my data and sharing the story out, that I incorporate a lot of qualitative data with the residents that we are trying to work with. And I feel that that has a tendency to help tell a fuller story and focus on equity more so in a representative light.
Thank you, Ashley. Michaela, did you want to go next?
Yeah, thanks, Claudia. So Envision Utah is a nonprofit based in Salt Lake, but we do projects throughout the state. Our biggest project was the Your Utah, Your Future vision, which was a statewide vision for 11 topic areas, including transportation, education, housing, air quality. So we touch on a lot of different things. Envision Utah's focus is more regional, and we're at maybe a higher level than planning. We call it visioning. And what that means is that we really like to bring people together to share their ideas and wants for the future of a certain topic or geography. So the outcome of our work really depends a lot on the perspectives that we have at the table. So our work in equity right now is still just getting started, but we're reflecting a lot on how we do more inclusive public engagement and how do we tap into diverse networks of leadership to make sure that our projects are well-rounded and that the final vision captures and reflects the voices of a lot of different people. So then I'll hand it off to Meredith.
Good afternoon, everybody. Yat-e. That's how we introduce ourselves in Navajo. She'e Meredith Lamia Shes, Senju Kaninchlank, Izithlana Bashish Chin. I am Denef from Page, Arizona. Not sure how many of you know that area. But really, my background has come from two different sides. The first being I work currently for Provo City School District as the Native American Education Coordinator or Director. So I've been a part of that program for over 12 years now. And the next part of my profession, which is kind of where I have seen another line of really helping in the disparities of our Native communities, specifically on the Navajo Reservation, is with my nonprofit work with Navajo Strong as their program director. You know, as far as equity, I feel like this is definitely a word that I'm so familiar with, having worked in the educational sector, but also in the nonprofit world, and firsthand seeing the disparities that have come across on the Navajo Reservation due to the COVID-19 outbreak. And so, you know, on both ends of those, it's very eye-opening for me to see the inequality, you know, that does exist in both of those realms. There's a lot of work, intentional work, that I think as communities we need to be doing to better the system. And when I say intentional, I'm using that verb because it's an active and very thoughtful word that we have to consider when we're thinking about equity and really taking this to heart. And when I look at the inequality and how it is affected, you know, the systems, specifically in education and on the reservation itself, I see the result of that. You know, I see the result of that when I do make those visits. And having spoken to educators, I feel like we can do better. You know, there's so much intentional work that we can do when we really do just, you know, ponder how we can change that framework. And so it's got to be an intentional action on our end. And so on the education side of it, my goal is to make sure that education is continuing in a matter where those narratives are being shared, not just from a conqueror's perspective, but more specifically from the perspective of those groups or underrepresented communities where those stories are not typically told from. And I believe that we are in a place in society where we do need to start hearing from those people and those perspectives from people in those communities. As far as my work in the nonprofit, I feel like education kind of carries over in that realm as well. As we share narratives and as we learn narratives, I believe that that is where those intentional actions of equity will start to be bettered, is when we start to understand where people are coming from, the history. Thank you, Stacy, for doing that wonderful land acknowledgement. I think the more that we speak positive, and we'll be talking about this later. I love the whole asset framework, you know, growth mindset. That's something that I stand by, is because when we are speaking and acknowledging where people are coming from, I think there is great power in that. And having been in education and now working across on the nonprofit side of things, I feel like that work continues every day. And that's something that I do not only on behalf of the students that are a very small portion of our district as Native students. I want them to be proud of who they are, and more specifically, not feeling like they have to shed their cultural skin when they come to school. This is where diversity and equity become really, really important, because it does affect the daily lives of not only students, but the people on the reservation. And once we start changing that framework and then being more intentional in our efforts towards equity, I believe that things will start changing.
Thank you so much, Meredith. I love that you really reminded us that this has to be intentional work, but also intersectional work. I think that is a great thing that we'll touch on a little bit later too. And Joe, did you want to give your quick intro as well before we kind of dive into the topics?
Sure, yeah. Thanks, Claudia. I'm Joe Taylor. I work for the Transportation Division in Salt Lake City. And what transportation does is basically just adjusts or improves the right-of-way within the boundaries of Salt Lake City. That's everything from, you know, changing the striping to, you know, transforming a corridor, moving things around. You know, transportation is an interesting kind of venue for equity, because the history of transportation projects have been, you know, very unequitably distributed and often in really destructive ways. I think that a clear example of that in you know, locally is I-15, the Belt Route, and this is not a city project, but that was supposed to be a look at where that loop isn't completed. I think that, you know, that can be really, really illustrative of just kind of how we've, you know, applied infrastructure projects. You know, I think in more recent history, our equity engagement has been, you know, somewhat perfunctory, attached to a specific project, and essentially checking a box. And so I think that we have, you know, a really long way to go to just try and be open to hearing from more people and building trust, and then instituting policy to reinforce those ideas. So yeah, I'm really excited to be here, and thanks for having me.
Thank you, Joe. That was a great segue into our next question. So the core of this discussion is really, how do we authentically, more intentionally engage with, show up, and affirm the needs of historically disenfranchised communities, and that includes BIPOC folks, rural communities, underrepresented and other marginalized communities as well. So with that, this is a question to everyone, and anyone that is willing to answer can respond, but how can we reimagine community engagement and planning to be more equity-based, and how can we better operationalize it? And feel free to chime in if you have something. Oh, there's Joe. Go ahead.
I'll fill the gap, sure. This is just kind of a specific thought, and I'll try and keep it brief because there's a lot of great information on this panel. But one thing that, you know, we have started thinking about is to try and separate our engagement from a specific project. I think that when you are working through a project, you're tied to a timeline and you're tied to a budget, and it kind of takes on a life of its own. And so it becomes difficult to really engage and build trust. And so we're trying to, as a department, you know, reach out to folks in ways that don't have anything to do with a specific bit of infrastructure, so that when we do have to come back and work on some infrastructure, there's, you know, at least a little bit of groundwork laid there.
Thank you so much, Joe. Yeah, I think oh, go ahead, Ashley. Don't want to cut you off.
No, I was just going to say that that's a wonderful idea, Joe. I picture it being that conversation that you just started about imagining a supportive space for the people who have not been in the room. I think we can only build at the speed of trust, and we should only build at the speed of trust. And so in creating a space where people can talk to you and you build a relationship with them so it is not tied to an outcome, I think is an amazing, amazing way to start. I would really love to see, when I speak of a supportive space, and especially BIPOC individuals or people who speak English as a second language or caregivers and things of that nature, is making sure that they have ways and open channels of being able to access like City Hall in times that are not 9 to 5 and things of that nature. I think that would be a really great way to at least start the conversation. And then of course, Jonathan Pacheco Bell always talks about embedding planning and getting away from your desk. I think that is one thing that I just want to see stick, like get away from City Hall, get away from your desk, go to the local park, go to the school community council meeting, like engage with folks where they are.
Ashley, I'd like to follow up on that because as a developer, a nonprofit developer that engages community from the very beginning, from when we purchase property to designing, we bring the various voices to the table. We talk about what impact will it have in the neighborhood, what impact will it have with you. When we bring families, what impact will it have with the schools. Where we tend to get stuck is when we move it up to the planning department, because they tend to operate from rules and regulations. And community, we understand the rules and regulation, but we need you to say, how can I help you accomplish this goal for community? Because any successes we have benefit the city. I've worked with planners for 40 years. I'm so excited for the next generation of planners, because this session is a good example of really educating and sensitizing future planners of how important it is to reach out to those communities. And it's not just the typical community councils. That's a good place to start, but the churches, the schools, the school community councils, the PTAs, just really reaching out to communities. Often they don't get asked to come to the table. And I think that needs to be a core value in any planning department.
Yeah, just to build off of that, Maria, I think that when I think about how to do better equity-based community engagement, I think approaching the community in a very humble way. As planners, recognizing that we are outsiders coming to that community where they truly are the experts. And I think that we really need to be able to check our biases as planners and recognize that we don't know, and all of our value comes from the community being able to interact with us and being able to share their knowledge with us. And recognizing that us as planners, we're really responsible for that our work shapes people's lives and affects their day-to-day life. I think that sometimes in planning processes, you might find yourself in a situation where you're talking with someone who's upset with you, who's angry with something that may be going on. But I think it's our responsibility as planners to be able to let people be mad at us and to understand the frustration of not being heard, and to be able to come to people and empower them within the planning process, and just generally being able to come into it with a lot of humility and ready to hear what people have to say to you.
I think this is a great discussion. And I think that what's important is to really understand the people, not just latch onto something that may be superficial about the community or about the organization. And I'll take it to an architecture place again, but I think about how some of the most significant architecture projects that we've had in Salt Lake City of recent years, to me, feel like they've fetishized something about Utah. I'm thinking of the Natural History Museum, the Eccles Theater, and the airport. They all are based on the Red Rock Canyons, which feels inappropriate to me because we're in northern Utah, we're not in southern Utah. But I think these outside architects come to Utah and they try and like learn something about our community, and they latch onto something really superficial and sort of use that to design their building. And I think planners can do that in the same ways, where we think that we've engaged with the community and we've thought of what the community needs, and you find one small thing, but really it's that deeper level of engagement and that deeper level of like actually understanding the community and being part of the community before you can tell the community what they need or what makes sense for them. So I think that, to me, I just always get annoyed when people are like, oh, the red rocks of Utah. And I'm like, why not? We're not in southern Utah. So let's think about something that northern Utah embodies. But
and then I just want to build off a little more on what Darren and Michaela shared. You know, being in a Native community and being a part of a Native community, you know, we have a word that we use often when we, well, especially when I'm working, you know, as far as on the working with a school district, which is urban, but then I'm also, you know, doing kind of consult work, you know, at the state level and then with the tribes. And so I can't stop and think of a word that we use often, which is called meaningful collaboration. I think that there's so much that can be done in that meaningful collaboration. And this kind of just goes off of what Michaela and Darren were saying, as far as really coming into a community, to come in there, you know, in a basically like in the attitude of just like, I'm here to fix things. You know, I think when we have an open mind and we really have a mind open to really having meaningful collaboration, you know, there's a lot that we can understand and come to understand with the community when we come with the attitude of just, I'm not here as a savior to fix things, but I'm here to listen to see how I can help, how can we do this? And so being open and having that meaningful collaboration, and I think is really important.
Thank you so much for your wonderful responses. Yeah, I gather that this work requires effort, time, can't be rushed. And I'm going to latch on to what Ashley said, that we need to build at the speed of trust. I think I need that on a t-shirt or something, because it just speaks to me, and everything that you all just shared really resonates with the idea that this work requires that intentional facilitation and that embedded engagement with communities. And I know Jonathan Pacheco-Bell was in the chat and he was giving you all some shout outs as well. But with that, I did want to transition to our next question. And to give it a little bit of context, when we engage with underrepresented communities, it's too often from a deficit standpoint. And I personally refrain from using the term minorities because it perpetuates some perceptions that these groups are less than, and it certainly misses the mark that in certain areas of society, these communities that we term as minorities are actually overrepresented in systems that operate under cycles of oppression, such as the criminal justice system, school to prison pipeline, and certain health or other socioeconomic inequities. So with that, question to you all is, you know, what does an asset-based framework of engagement mean to you? And in other words, how do we go from what's wrong to what's strong within a community?
So I'll start. I think about, okay, so one of the things that I'm really grateful for in my career is that I was invited to take over a course that Keith Bartholomew was the brainchild of, People in Place. I don't know if any of you took that course, but I was the architecture side of the combined course for I think 3 or 4 years. And there were a couple of things happening at the same time. Before I was selected to teach that course, it was already determined that the course was going to focus on the ballpark neighborhood. But while between the time that I was selected to teach the course and when we started teaching, I purchased a home in the ballpark neighborhood and moved into it. So it became my home. And it was a very beginning architecture and planning students, and the course was go into this neighborhood and try and propose projects that would make the neighborhood better. And I kept hearing the students saying things like, oh, the neighborhood's really poor and really run down and really bad. And I thought, well, that's my neighborhood. So it was interesting to think, okay, do I do that in my day-to-day life where I come into a community to build a building and think, okay, how can I as the professional fix this? And I kept trying to remind them, like, hey, talk about the positive things about the neighborhood and talk about, you know, some of the great businesses that are there, and focus on the potential, not focusing on the problems within the community. And it was just interesting as a professor teaching a course where I was hearing students talking about a neighborhood and talking about it in ways that were not positive, and feeling like, oh, well, actually, I have a different perspective because I live there. So I think just making sure that we're checking our egos at the door when we're going in and working in a new place, and realizing that people chose to live there for a reason, and people chose to be part of that community, or were born into that community, but we are outsiders. And so respecting the community that's already there and not trying to change that, but trying to improve it.
Yes, I definitely I think that's so important, Darren. Like it's so important. Like for me at least, you know, I do a lot of engagement with children and families. So the Promise program engages a lot with schools. And I remember in my first year, right, we have a leadership committee and we started like subcommittees. And at the time, the leadership committee wasn't particularly diverse. And we started engaging with parents and schools, and we got some data that was highlighting a really high number of chronic absence. And I noticed that our first instinct was to wonder if there was like a health or transportation concern or something worse that was going on that was causing kids to miss full days of school. So what we did was we went and actually spoke to the parents, and with some cultural competency, we came to realize that the school had a high Latinx population, and they have a tendency to go and visit family for long periods of time over the holiday, right? Like they extend their holiday vacation. And so our intervention, you know, or what we were thinking we were going to do to help initially was to throw a whole bunch of health resources at them, and you know, have some like parent conversations on just like chronic absence. But it turned out the better way to help fix, well, not necessarily fix the issue of chronic absence, but celebrate the fact that, you know, you're having family connections and enjoying all of this. You know, and a lot of data has shown that like kids who travel, it really provides them better educational experiences. We just wanted to ask the parents, you know, how can we better support your child's education retention? You know, do you need some support packets to take with you? Do you need some help making sure that they can catch up okay? Like, how do we base the conversation around support instead of, like Darren said, fixing something that we assume is a problem, but is really something to be celebrated? I also have been working on park improvement, and I remember one of the things that I kept seeing in the description of the park is that, you know, it's underutilized because it's in a poor neighborhood. It's underutilized. But when I got from behind my desk and spent time at the park doing site visits and taking in like some population data on usage, it turns out the park is utilized, but the baseball and the volleyball courts that were there were underutilized because that population does not play baseball or volleyball. So it's not necessarily that it's underutilized because they're poor. It's underutilized because the what's being provided as an amenity that we would view an amenity is not an amenity. So I wound up surveying a lot of the kids in maybe like 4 different languages, just talking to the kids, talking to their grandparents who actually took care of them while their children were at work, because that population, like 75% of the residents that live there are under 18 years old. So that means that our engagements really need to be kid focused. But they really did help us like redesign the park and really talk about what their needs were, and it was completely something different. And what these kids had to say, they knew what they wanted. You know, they know what they've seen in other parks. They know what it's like to go to Liberty Park and see what's offered there and then come home and know what's missing.
That is perfect. Oh, and I just want to respond to Ashley's question really quick, or response that I think that really captures how equity is trying to provide people what they need, not what we think they need. Or I think there's often that distinction that people don't make between equity and equality, that equality is giving everything the same thing, and that equity is really trying to get to that point, like you were saying, Ashley, of what is missing or what information are we missing to actually make an informed decision about how to improve the quality of life for folks. So Joe, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. I saw that you unmuted.
No, please. I was just going to say, my favorite thing about transportation is that everybody does it. and everybody does it in a unique way. And so there's really nobody that you can find that doesn't have something to teach you about how the transportation system works. And so just trying to keep that in mind, I think is what makes it.
Thanks, Joe. Michaela?
Ashley, while you were talking, it just made me think about the communication barriers that exist within planning, and not just language barriers, but also academic vocabulary versus, what people speak in their everyday lives. And then as what you mentioned, places that we see as special and amenities versus what they actually see and how it plays out once whatever it is actually on the ground. I think when planners go out and do public engagement, it's really easy to go in with a specific question to get certain useful information out of it. And if the person we're talking to doesn't respond in the right scope or in the right terms, it can be hard for us to incorporate that information into what we're doing. And they might know everything that you're talking about, but they've just never called it planning or land use before. Like the way that I talk about these things at work and in groups like this is very different from how I talk to them about talk to my family about it, right? And talk to my own personal community. So I think we need to make sure that we're hearing the things that we're not necessarily asking for, and then actually being able to find ways to incorporate it into what we're doing. Not just saying like, wow, that was a really insightful, thoughtful comment, but I have no idea how to actually make that part of this plan. And I think that this is exactly what you said, Ashley, like it's how we build trust in the community. It does take a long time, and that's as fast as you can move. And it's how people know that you're being genuine, and you need to really be ready to come and listen to the whole person that's there, not just kind of this cookie cutter part that we want to hear.
And then I was just gonna go ahead and I love what you said there, Michaela. I feel like, having been in this situation where a lot of times, coming from an underrepresented community and just being a Navajo woman, I've, had to make my voice known many times, when people approach, well, for sure, in the educational system, when it comes to American Indian education, it's always led with this connotation of negativity as far as the Indian problem, or, Indian education always denotes this whole idea of, there's an issue, it's always approached as in this mindset of being a continual issue. And very seldom do I ever meet, actual educators or administrators who, instead of really talking about the negative sides of, communities or how communities approach education, I think it's so important for them. And this is why professional development, and is also really important, when people invest in that, I think that's really important, is to switch that mindset, as far as becoming more of just like, how can we solve this issue? Highlight and look at what's best for those communities. A lot of things that I bring up with, for example, I often use Navajo because that is the community I come from and the community I represent. We have an idea of which is kinship. And that's something that is completely defining for any thriving community. And it is an old traditional, it's a part of our language, it's a part of our culture. When we embody this idea of it means that we are all literally family. We're all connected. And so, people who do come to the reservation often don't know the intricacies of how really is such a strong portion of what we believe. And I think that once you understand that, and a little more of the history of where the Navajo people come from, and not just Navajo people, but there's like 574 recognized tribes in the United States, all with their own idea of and positive, teachings from their traditions and culture. But when you come into these communities, I often like to look at the positive, how has this been a strength? How do we utilize in our communities? And a lot of that will go back to how we gather and how we help one another. And especially in education, I like to get people into this mindset of shifting the negative to the positive. What can we what can we build off of this idea of community and kinship, you know, as we're looking at bettering a community or helping out. And usually I think oftentimes it comes down to really these parents who will come with the idea of helping their students. It really, you know, to kind of pull them back into this mindset of it's not about us, like it's about what we're doing for the students, their futures, and really the future of the community. You know, when we highlight that, I feel like there is so much more benefits that come. And then when people from the outside are looking, when I've had administrators who've been over me for years, you know, and have seen the kind of program that I like to run with gathering, you know, our families, I think they are able to see there's so much that they didn't know about, you know, Native communities that now they can kind of understand and get a glimpse of that. But definitely highlighting, you know, the positive of our communities and looking at them in a different scope rather than having these stereotypical mindsets that really do just block us, you know, from understanding the beauties of a community and how their potential for growth can and fostering and continuing those traditions, I think is really important.
Meredith, I want to follow up on that because I appreciate those comments. I know that, again, when we go into communities, when we moved into one particular neighborhood, we saw barriers all around the neighborhood. And I always think that the greatest assets when we're in communities are the people that live there and the people that will be impacted by the work that we do. So we saw tracks, freeway, viaducts. They saw a way to protect their neighborhood, to create their own little island. We saw a I-15 underpass that was dark and dingy. They saw an opportunity to create one of Utah's largest public mural projects. We saw vacant lots that were abandoned. They saw an opportunity to turn it into a park. And so it's really, you know, boots on the ground, talking to the assets, the people that live in those communities and having that conversation, like Ashley mentioned, you know, really getting behind outside of your desk and just watching and listening. And you know, I know when I met with several of the families in the community, I was like, who's going to build right next to a freeway? And they're like, well, why not? Why wouldn't we build next to a freeway? And again, you know, it's just listening and you know, not having filters get in the way. So I really am a huge believer that the greatest assets are the people that live in those communities.
Thank you, Maria, and thank you, everyone. I'm moved by all of your responses, and what came to mind as you were all speaking is really, you know, how do we move from planning being a problem-based field to an opportunity-based field? So often, like everyone had said, we go into communities thinking that we have to fix things, but you know, we have to pause and give ourselves that time to really listen to see exactly what people are experiencing day to day, and maybe the problems that we thought were problems are just different lived experiences that we're not familiar with. So thank you all so much for that. So now to our next question, to wrap up our discussion here, and before we transition into the Q&A with our audience, I'd like for you all to respond to the following quote from one of my planning heroes, who's Jay Pitter. He's a senior fellow at the Canadian Urban Institute, very equity-centered planner. And she said, "Urbanists often consider themselves visionaries and solution finders. However, great placemaking occurs when professionals center community-based knowledge and approach each project with curiosity and a desire to learn." As we did in the intro, I'd love if we kind of go round robin, and if you could all react, share your thoughts on this quote for 1 to 2 minutes. And I'm going to put the quote in the chat so that you can reference it again and so that our audience can take a look at it. But yeah, if anyone wants to share, please go ahead. I can also put you on the spot if that's easiest too. Michaela, did you have anything to share? Anything you want to start us off with?
Sure, I'll start off. I completely agree with the quote. You know, like I said earlier, I think community members are the experts here. They have the most intimate knowledge and experience with that space to know how it functions in day-to-day life and what that space means to the people who actually live there. So just every project is so different. And even if you have a degree in planning, you've been a planner for decades, I think it's important to still approach every process with fresh eyes and readiness to learn. So I'll give it to Joe. Oh, Darren, no, Darren.
Okay. I was just, as you were talking, I think it's also important to remember what happens to projects when we leave them. Great spaces are not just beautiful spaces, but they're used spaces, and they're spaces that communities go to, and the spaces that communities meet each other at. And so we can make something incredibly beautiful, but if it's not embraced by the community and no one uses it, it's not a great space. And the same thing with buildings, you know, if the architect's just so focused on doing something that looks good in their portfolio, that's great, but that can get demolished at any point. It's buildings that people actually use and love that become gems. And so I think it's important to remember that we're not designing for ourselves and we're not planning for ourselves, we're planning for other people, and that we need to make sure that what we're doing has buy-in from that community.
Joe, did you want to go ahead?
Sure. Yeah, I definitely think of myself as a public servant before I think of myself as an urbanist. You know, we have all these really cool solutions that, you know, can put a really innovative, you know, bus pathway or bike lane together. But and it's great when we get to do that. It's fun. But our job is to make the right of way system work for the people who live there, right? That's who we work for, and we, you know, have to listen to them to do that. So yeah, I think it's about public service first.
Thanks so much, Joe. Maria, did you want to respond?
Sure, I like the quote. I think what I would add to it, I had to really think about it, and I had to think about what an urbanist is and whether I am an urbanist or not, because it's kind of a new word for me. But as I looked at the quote, I think I would add listen, to a desire to learn, listen, and willingness to incorporate what they learn.
Thank you, Maria.
And I say that just because, you know, we've worked again with a lot of consultants, a lot of planners that come out, and they do have the desire to learn. They take a lot of the information and they don't do anything with it. And I always think reciprocity is important. What community gives to you, you need to give something back. It's very important.
That's so real. I'm gonna go because I had to sit with this for a while on the reciprocity thought. So I really love the quote. I think it's great. The second part of it is great. I have a hard time talking about, you know, adding the word visionary to things that we do as planners. I think it's really pretentious and it kind of grosses me out, to be completely honest, just because I feel like there are barely any new ideas under the sun anymore. We can't keep regurgitating things that others, especially poor BIPOC people, create from survival and necessity and like rebrand it and appropriate it as like new game. Like agri-hoods are not new. Mobile tiny homes are not new. Tiny villages are not new. They were shanty towns. Like we have to stop like rebranding these things as some cool thing that an urbanist is doing. Like poor people have been living out of necessity and survival for a long time, and that has literally shaped the way that America looks right now. Like that's literally why our parcels are shaped a certain way. That's why cities are shaped a certain way. It's just really important, I feel, to kind of unpack the whole visionary conversation that's going on when people really, at least to me, when I think of good, you know, visionaries like Jane Jacobs or W.E.B. Du Bois, they really have that reciprocity going on where they listen to people and fight to apply it, you know, and for some reason, I guess that's being called a visionary, but urbanists have kind of maybe taken it to a whole nother extreme. And, you know, as a planner, we have to be real. We basically use other cities and cultures as like Pinterest boards to like self-select aesthetics for others. And all I'm saying is give the public the password to the Pinterest board and you work as like discovery staff to bring it to light. If we can, you know, pretty much scrap the first sentence from being a practice in the profession, I think that'd be awesome. We need to listen in all caps, find new ways to listen in all caps, fight to listen, and center community-based knowledge.
I think that's awesome. I love what you said, Ashley. I 100% agree. Because often I feel like, you know, where I have come from and where I see people, oftentimes I totally relate to the whole being grossed out with the word visionary, because many times I know that people are well-intentioned and they really want to come and fix a problem and they have this idea, but also it's like you kind of have to lose that like savior mentality in the same light to really make like effective change. And that's what I mean when I'm saying like intentional thought when it comes to approaching equity, and just really being in the deepest and most like profound way, just humble, you know, just come in a humble atmosphere, but also being willing to really take in the surrounding narrative, the narratives that people have lived, but not only that, but celebrate also the resistance of these communities that have really gone through so much, and really celebrate that. Bring out the positive and recognize. I think there's so much power that comes into recognizing things, like the whole land recognition in the beginning. I feel like when we have that power to recognize the positives and the ability and celebrate those victories, you know, we are being humble in that way to where we can make an effort to building trust. And I believe that, you know, when relationships are built on this transparency, both ways, I feel like there's so much more that we can learn, and being transparent, being open, I think can really just break down so many barriers. You know, when we approach a community, just being open, but not coming in the mindset of just, I'm here to help, I'm here to save. You know, that's no, I don't think any problems, you know, get solved in that manner. But just really being open and willing to listen to what, you know, maybe what those issues are or what they've experienced, because we're all in this experience together. And I feel like when we're able to really just taking thoughtful consideration what we have lived and how our communities have thrived, what are those positive things, but really celebrate and just continue carrying on the power of how those communities have thrived for those many years and what has worked. I think that bringing that out is really important, and will continue to make, you know, hopefully efforts in being able to progress, you know, in understanding and helping communities more.
Thank you so much, Meredith. Yeah, I really resonate with that and everything that was just shared. There's a little saying that I have within my little friend group, my personal group, that, you know, we are our ancestors' wildest dreams. And I think that that experience that you shared, Meredith, that just really, yeah, coming down to that core belief that when we are more connected, more collaborative, more listening centered, you know, everyone is the better for it. So I will be the first one to say that I was taking notes this entire time, and I learned so much from everyone's experience here, and just it's been a very growing conversation with great insight, great direction, and a lot of things to reflect on, both as planners, as just members of our community in general, as leaders, and you know, advocates for growth and for opportunity for communities that have for so long been not part of the conversation, not been at the table, or not given those opportunities in order to thrive. So just thank you so much to all of our panelists for their time, their experience, and their commitment to this work. I know in a virtual setting it's a little hard, but if you all want to give a little virtual round of applause through your little reactions, you can just, yeah, share some love. I think this has just been such an incredible conversation to have. Thank you. Yeah, I see some folks clapping for you. Perfect. So we have until 1:15 to now open up to our audience for questions. So please place your questions in the chat box or raise your hand. I'm going to take a look at the raise hand box to see who is asking a question. So let's see. We have, I think it was CJ. I think CJ, I just saw your hand go up, but I'm not sure if I see it anymore. Did you have a question?
Yeah, I guess I was just gonna first just say thank you so much to all the panelists, and you, Claudia. You did an amazing job moderating. Yeah, I just want to, I guess, ask about if there's a project that all the panelists are most excited about that they have already done, or maybe a future project that they would like to share. I would just love to hear your thoughts.
I have one. I'd have one I'd like to share if I could. It's called the BOB Project, the Bridge Over Barriers Project, and it's on 600 West and 300 North. And it was a 5-year process that involved 1,500 residents from the Jackson and Guadalupe neighborhood. And it was taking this dark underpass where 3,000 students a day would walk under with Jackson Elementary and West High School. And they were frightened by it, and it didn't have any lighting. And so the students at West High brought community together and brought us to the table. And over a 5-year period, 18 artists, 1,500 residents and students from the area came up with images that celebrated the diversity of Salt Lake City's West Side. They learned how to do mosaic. They learned how to put a mural. We brought all the churches together, and each church wanted their own religious figure. And what they agreed on was Father Time and Mother Earth, which everyone could relate to. And it was an amazing community engagement process, but it was not an easy process. And those, I think, are the types of projects that build community in so many different ways. And Salt Lake City planning was a big part of helping us get permits. It wasn't an easy process, but there's always an important role that a planner can play in those types of large community engagement processes.
Thank you, Maria. We do have some other questions in the chat, and I know Luis had asked this kind of in the middle of our conversation, but to get back to his question, it was, as planners, who are we leaving behind? Luis, I don't know if you wanted to maybe elaborate a little on your question, if you're able to unmute.
Yes, because I'm trying to understand these, because we have so many factors and details that involve this part, or when you go to affordability for housing, or just social or gender, but that are like talking about planning and housing. I was trying to figure out, like, okay, we have some factors happening of supply, demand, but when you're talking as academics, research, we have one perspective, but developers, that like builders, have their other perspective, and neighbors, residents, they have their other perspective. So how we could understand like who we're leaving behind? Because for one company, I'm building the house, but okay, house now, like a family home, is no more nor less than 300,000. So a townhome is now this value. But when you talk with somebody else from New York or California, this is cheap. But for somebody from living here in Utah, make like 2,000 a month, they will not be qualified if they need to finance this home. I don't know if it was a little clear.
I'll respond to that. This is a question that we as a city are wrestling with every day, and it's, I believe, maybe our most pressing issue right now is the cost of housing, the fact that wages are not increasing at the same rate that housing costs are, even close to the same rate. And in Utah, Salt Lake, we're a pretty progressive city council and mayor, but we are in a very conservative state. The Constitution of the United States places a lot of restrictions on, or like land rights are really protected within the Constitution of the United States, and even more by Utah state law. So it's really hard. We're wrestling with this a lot right now, is how do we make sure that we can create policies that don't mean that people are getting kicked out of their homes, or that mean that we can get enough housing in order to house the people that need to house, that need to live here and that want to live here, while at the same time dealing with the political pressure of things like, oh, we don't, you know, people that I can't tell you how many times I hear people telling me, do not approve this rezone, or do not make this ordinance because this is going to change the single family character of my neighborhood, and that's why I moved here. And I have a really hard time with that, because A, I know if I push too hard on that, I'll get kicked out of my job. But B, if I listen to that too hard, single family housing is the least affordable form of construction. A single building on a single lot, not connected to anyone else, is the least affordable way to build something. So it's really hard right now. I don't know what the answer is, or that there is an answer, but it's a political question. It's a question of geometry, like how do you get that many people a space to live in this much land? And I think it's probably the biggest issue that we're facing right now as a city, if you ask me.
Thank you, Councilmember Romano. That was great insight. Now we have a question from Ronnie, who asked, what ways have you identified a community's identity without directly asking? Ronnie, did you want to add any more to that, or are you good?
I guess to provide a little bit of clarity, I just kind of, it's just a theme that's just kind of been repeated throughout this, this discussion, and more that I find out as a planner is sometimes it's not necessarily what, community members say, like just being able to just be present with them and like just see how they move through a space, and like, you can kind of understand some of their values and things like that. And so I was very curious to see from your perspective of everyone in the panel who have, worked in the field, like what ways have you been able to grasp that without directly asking them exactly what they want? Like, have you like mostly just kind of sat down with them and just trying to talk about, just everyday things that are going on in their lives? Or, have you just kind of sat down on a bench and just watched them days on end? Like, how do you guys get a whole full rounded picture, of the community and what their heart's desires are, and really pull that DNA and build off of it?
I'm gonna try and answer that. I'm gonna try. We'll see if it turns out to anything good. But for me, at least, we have PTAs and school community councils and things of that nature, right? That's still kind of like our city community councils, funnels in a certain type of person that is available to work because of their workday schedule, right? So then you have people who need after school care to be able to take care of their children and get from point A to point B and get them fed and things of that nature. So I have in the past gone to after school programming as opposed to going to the PTA or the school community council. Sorry, that was my kid. And then also, I have been, I am from a single parent household. I have been a child who has experienced chronic homelessness. I have a lot of ACEs scores. I feel like for me, I've been able to reach out to their direct service providers. So like housing case managers, sorry. Okay. Housing case managers, people who work at food banks directly with the community, resident managers at like multifamily housing complexes, talking to direct service providers. And when I talk to these direct service providers, I realize that one, they genuinely love their community members. A lot of the times they have been someone who has walked down the same path and then wind up working at the nonprofit, right? So they usually wind up being from a differently abled population, being BIPOC, being someone who speaks a different language. I feel that that has created the best engagement. Like I have a really good relationship with, say, like the Refugee Services Department or Bud Bailey or the Sunnyvale Neighborhood Center, because they spend the most time with this community and can, you know, ask the parents when they have time. Like if they're coming to pick up the kids anyway, how about we just, you know, let them know that a planner is asking for blah, blah, blah. Or, you know, or what their thought is on that. And this way you don't have to stress their time, because, you know, we don't pay people for their expertise. Unfortunately, we haven't made it to a point where our city budget can pay residents for their very skilled knowledge. You know, we haven't handed over that keys of access of power and restorative justice and reparations. So until we can get there, we should probably like not stress them out so much if they're not you know, available with time.
Thanks, Ashley. That's a great segue into these next few questions that we got from Keith and Stacy that are very similar. And it's basically, how do planners engage with the idea of restorations or reparations, or go through that process of healing past wrongs? Any thoughts on that? Ashley? Yeah, open to anyone.
So I just recently read an article, and I'll have to find it again. A city in Illinois, they just put in their budget, and I think they pulled some money from the state as well for like a housing reparations. Okay, like a housing reparation system. Okay. And pretty much what that is like in an area that was historically redlined, and, you know, Black people are still living there. They have worked with, say, like HUD and their own city staff to create a budget to make like housing access more affordable and just go ahead and pay for stuff. Like, I don't know why it's a problem to just go ahead and pay for someone's upgrades to their house. I'm not sure. But when I think about reparations, you know, as a Black woman in America, you know, I think of just being able to provide people things. I don't understand why that's so hard, because we give away so many tax credits and we use tax increment financing like way too much for certain things. So why don't we do that to provide housing? I don't understand what the barrier is to just provide people things. And then, you know, if you can't do that, at least pay them for their time or give them some access to power. You know, if you can't give them land or help them get a home, which is kind of the only way to provide, you know, wealth generation for our families. You know, Black people, we have an 8-generation gap. We have 8 generations wealth gap. And I don't know how we're going to get over that unless there's some push and pull. You're gonna have to let go of some things.
Thanks, Ashley. So we have 2 other questions, and I feel that Caitlin, your question about, you know, what groups, projects, or events you recommend for the public to get involved in, I think that would be a great exit question. I do want to go to Laura's question real quick, just because I think it might need a little bit more clarification. But Laura, your question was, you know, how to, or should the community that stands to benefit be included from the start in order to mitigate the naysayers? And I think you're referencing that in terms of those that are the loudest sometimes are the most opposed. Did you want to elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, it really was sparked by something that Darren was talking about a little bit earlier. And it just made me think, from a policy perspective, a lot of the things that planners are engaging in have to go through public approval or council approval or different levels of government. And there's lots of opportunity for people who don't want the status quo to change to make their voices heard. And that's what I'm referencing in terms of being the loudest. I'm down in Utah County, and probably one of the best examples right now is UVX had planned a bus stop right near BYU's campus that was near an upper and single family home neighborhood, and the residents of that neighborhood during the planning process got the bus stop removed from the plan. And now the city is working retroactively with community leaders and students and the university to try to get that back into the plans. And I just think if the naysayers or the opposition voice wasn't quite so loud from the start, maybe we wouldn't have that problem. And so just more ways to include, how do you, when you know there's going to be opposition, how do you make sure you've organized in a way so that you have the people who support the program or who are going to benefit from the plan or whose idea the plan was to get as much space as the opposition takes up?
I guess since that question was kind of directed towards me, I'll take a stab at it. I think, and I don't know that I'm going to answer your question, I might actually make it more complicated, but I think what's interesting to me right now is that I think traditionally land use and local politics has been set up in a way that's very inequitable. It's like, you know, set up that here's the process, you do A, B, C, and then D, and then you've checked off your community engagement, and then you can do whatever you were going to plan on doing anyway. And you set up, you know, here's the community councils that you meet with, and like Ashley said, they're the people that had the time, that had the luxury of being involved in those organizations. And so I think traditionally it's been set up in a way that is just inherently problematic, where we don't have space for people that may actually be affected. We have space for people that the space is geared or is accessible to people that already have power and money. So I think that's an issue. What is interesting that I'm seeing recently, and I think what is our job as educated professionals, is to actually try and educate the public a bit more about what's happening. Because what I've seen more recently actually is you have the traditional community council voices that are listened to, that are typically the ones that are more NIMBY and don't want things to change because they've invested in a community and they own a house and they're set up. They don't have a housing problem, they own a house. But what we've been seeing more recently is more activist groups, which is, and maybe it's just because I'm now a city council member, so I'm seeing it, but more activist groups that are coming to our meetings and engaging in an excellent way. But a lot of times we haven't done a good job as public officials educating the public as to why we're doing certain things, and people just expect that we're doing things to make other developers rich or to do things. And a lot of times, like the recent one that we had on Tuesday, we had a lot of people come to our meeting and speak about something. It's been interesting to, like, you know, a lot of people come and said, you know, what you're doing is just making developers rich and you're kicking people out of their houses. There's a few things that I actually learned from there. And it's like, okay, we do need to tweak a couple things, but we just haven't done a good job of explaining why we're doing what we're doing. And it's now sort of energized this sort of activist mentality that like anything the government's doing is wrong, even if it's good policy. So I think there's a lot to unpack with your question. And I'm not sure exactly where to go to that, but I think my job is to educate people better.
Thank you so much.
Build on Councilmember Mono's statement. You don't have to be in the city government very long to identify who you hear from, right? They make it really obvious. And I think we're starting to think of, you know, maybe a big part of our job is to develop tools to empower themselves. And that's not easy, but, you know, I think it's probably what, as public servants, we owe to our public.
Thank you so much, Joe and Darren. I know we're running we're close to the 15-minute mark there. But did anyone else have anything to share before we end? I know we have one last question from, sorry, I'm just trying to find it now, Caitlin, who asked for thoughts about groups, projects, or events that you all would recommend for the audience here to get involved in right now. Would anyone be willing to end on that note?
Well, I am happy to invite everyone to our annual Paint Your Heart Out that we hope will happen in August, where we organize about 300 volunteers to come out and paint homes for the elderly or those with limited physical abilities on a Saturday in August. Keep our fingers crossed, and a lot of people come out to donate this, and it's a lot of fun and has huge impact for the individual that lives there, but also for the team that comes together. So if you want more details, visit our website.
And in that same light, thank you, Maria. I'm going to actually check that out myself. But I wanted to just put a plug in there for Navajo Strong. So our website, navajostrong.org. If you, as involved with your communities or work, we've had a lot of corporations that have reached out and have done donation drives, you know, because we're still actively going to the Navajo reservation on a weekly basis. And so, you know, there's a lot of need there on the reservation. And so if anybody wants to donate or volunteer, please just seek out navajostrong.org. We'd love to have volunteers or donator, people giving donations. That would be always appreciated. And so thanks for having me today.
Thank you. Thank you, Meredith and Maria, for those follow-up opportunities. In closing, just again, thank you so much to our panelists and for those that asked questions, for everyone here who joined us. It has been just a great conversation. I think lots of opportunities to continue to learn and grow, and that's exactly what equity learning is. I don't think we ever get to the point where we're perfect experts in equity learning or equity action. It's just a constant journey of understanding what people need, and in dynamic communities. I mean, there's just so many different communities that, you know, that are out there, and we can't assume that one solution will fit everyone. So thank you everyone again. And as an invitation, please join us for our last session of our Internalizing Equity series on April 8th. We have the pleasure and honor of hosting embedded planner Jonathan Pacheco Bell, who's actually here with us, I believe. And he will be reiterating, you know, that idea that we cannot plan from our desks, and we need to be embedded in communities to really understand how to better serve and provide opportune outcomes. So you can register on the MCMP website, and we can also, I'm going to put that in the chat real quick. And we're also hoping that you can take a post survey for us to, you know, help us better understand how to present these topics, identify future opportunities that you would like to see in terms of equity and planning. And again, thank you all so much for joining us, and we hope to see you at our next session, and spread the word for that. And if there's any questions that you didn't get to ask today, feel free to email me or any Stacy as well if there's questions that you still haven't asked, and we're happy to connect you to folks that can answer them. But with that, thank you all again, and have a great rest of your day.